Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Sorota. I'm head of research at the Office of Eric Schmidt, where I oversee a program here on AI and democratic innovations. I'm very pleased to be moderating today's conversation on scaling democratic innovations. I see some people have already taken the lead in the chat without me even needing to ask. So thank you for saying who you are and where you're calling in from. I'm calling in from New York, and it's actually quite a lovely day here. I'm really excited for this conversation today. It is the not the first in a series of conversations that Claudia and Sammy have been leading around this idea of scaling democratic innovations and scaling deliberative democracy more broadly. And I've been extremely pleased to be joining them along the ride for this intellectual journey. I think hopefully at least some of you in this group were able to join our last conversation on five dimensions of scaling democratic deliberation. And if that conversation was really focused on the what do we mean when we say we're trying to scale deliberation or scale democratic innovation, today's conversation is going to be a bit more about the how. So how does that actually come into being? And as Claudia and Sammy will discuss, this is not a technical or technological question primarily. It's really a question about institutions and relationships and politics. And as a result, I think it's actually a bit less clear about how that actually comes into being. And so I am grateful to Claudia and Sammy for opening the door to this conversation. And I would encourage the rest of the attendees and participants to give your own contributions through the chat. I know in previous conversations we've held, the chat has been quite on fire. So I hope the same is true for this one. To set expectations for the agenda for the next hour and a half or so, in a few moments, I'll pass it over to Claudia and Sammy for about 20 minutes of their presentation. And then we will invite our three lovely discussants today, Josh, Nicole, and Kelly, to give reflections for around 30 minutes. And then we'll open it to questions from the chat and just a broader discussion with the group. And so with that, I will pass it over to Claudia and Sammy. I'm sure you know both of them quite well, but I will introduce them nonetheless. So starting with Claudia, Claudia Chwalisz is the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext. She previously led the OECD's work on innovative citizen participation from 2018 to 2022, where she developed the Deliberative Democracy Toolbox and co-authored key reports and standards. Claudia played a central role in designing the world's first permanent citizens' assemblies and has advised governments and institutions globally on deliberative processes. Sammy McKinney is an AI and deliberation fellow at Democracy Next and a PhD student in politics and international studies at the University of Cambridge. His PhD research critically explores the integration of artificial intelligence into democratic innovations, especially citizens' assemblies. So thanks so much for kicking us off. And with that, I'll hand it over to the two of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thanks to everyone who has joined us for the event today. We are excited to be sharing this paper that Sammy and I have been working on for the past 6 months together about scaling democratic innovations and the role of what we've called scaling catalysts, what they play in that, also the tensions that these organizations navigate, as well as the frontiers of future practice. And as Andrew mentioned, this builds on our previous paper about 5 dimensions of scaling democratic deliberation. And before we dive in right into the presentation about this paper itself, let me just briefly introduce Democracy Next for those of you who may be joining us here for the first time. So Democracy Next is an international research and Action Institute focused on broadening who has power and improving how we make decisions together on the basis of these 3 core principles of sortition, deliberation, and rotation. Sortition meaning randomly selecting decision makers, deliberation being about having structured spaces for shared learning and collective decision making, and rotation about the shared privilege and responsibility of representing others and being represented. So in this paper, we look more specifically at what we're calling scaling catalysts, organizations that intentionally drive the expansion of democratic innovations in their regions. And the questions that we had as the starting point for this research was about what makes these organizations effective? What features and attributes underpin their success? And what does it take to build or support such an organization? So, to try and get at some answers to these questions, we conducted 22 interviews at 9 leading democracy innovation organizations spread across 3 continents. And to understand a bit more in depth, we did deep dives with the kind of ecosystems around Aranzazu Lab in the Basque Country, and We Do Democracy in Denmark, where we also did extensive interviews with their wider kind of set of people in their ecosystems. And we complemented this with interviews of leaders or managers of 7 other organizations in other countries that shared some similarities and differences with one another. And we also looked into various impact reports and documents of all these organizations so that we could try to identify the patterns that persisted regardless of context. And the focus in this paper is predominantly on deliberative forms of democratic innovations, particularly citizens' assemblies. But it's important to emphasize that the organizations that we interviewed deliver and advocate for a wider repertoire of participatory and deliberative practices, not just citizens' assemblies. And we actually suggest that this is one of the core features of their success. So even though a lot of our analysis is geared towards citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy, the findings aren't limited to them and are relevant more broadly. We had 3 goals at the outset of doing this research. One was to recognize and elevate the critical role that these organizations play, especially at a time when a lot of the focus around scaling tends to focus on the role of technology and AI. Second is about distilling the characteristics that make these organizations successful. And third, exploring the frontiers of future practice beyond individual organizations. We had 3 core audiences in mind when doing this work. The first being practitioners who are building similar organizations, funders who are seeking to support this really vital work, and also researchers identifying knowledge gaps. Our kind of key overall takeaway from all this work is that scaling democratic innovations demands intentional infrastructure building, the kind of relational, strategic, and capacity building work that transforms one-off experiments into embedded democratic practices. So let's dive into some of the meat of the paper then, covering the 6 features of successful scaling catalysts that we identified. So this is an overview of the 6, but we're going to talk through them briefly one by one together with Sammy. So starting with the first one, that the scaling mission is explicit for these organizations that we're talking about. Their mission statements reference scaling, spreading, institutionalizing, embedding deliberative practices and democratic innovations. Their theories of change that drive their work really focus beyond single projects. And the kinds of activities that they undertake are really much more than doing one-off assembly projects. They really foreground network building, capacity building, evaluation and learning, as well as advocacy. Second is that change is relational. These organizations really understand that cultivating connections with power holders and stakeholders is not just like an extra thing to do, but is really essential. Scaling Catalysts invests heavily in this relational work, and they do so in a cross-partisan way. It's important to emphasize, maintaining strategic autonomy from power as well. And thirdly, they have a strong commitment to quality. So they carry out independent evaluations of the projects that they undertake. They also publish impact reports. They engage quite heavily in dissemination activities around the work that they do. Most of the interviewees also mentioned the importance of the OECD good practice principles for deliberative processes. And the reasoning behind this is really strategic. Poor quality assemblies not only fail to deliver, but they also actively harm the field by confirming skeptics' doubts and burning political capital. At the same time, the interviewees also emphasize that it's necessary to be flexible about how you apply some of these good practical principles in the light of local context as well.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks to everyone joining us here today, and thanks to our fantastic discussants. It's really an honor to have an event like this. So to continue where Claudia left off, the 4th feature of successful scaling catalysts is the ability to bridge the local and the global. So this principle relates to the way that scaling catalysts position themselves as bridges or bridge builders between the global community of democratic innovation practice and their local context. So this can include various kinds of translational work, including linguistic translation. For example, Arendt's Lab and We Do Democracy are two deep dive case studies translated the OECD good practice principles into Basque and Danish, respectively. But it also includes various kinds of social and political translation. So, for example, catalysts attend global conferences to learn about best practices in different parts of the world, and then translate these learnings into their own cultural and institutional contexts, as well as offering their own experiences as wider lessons to advance the global community of practice. So the bridging function is bidirectional. Catalysts absorb lessons from different parts of the world and then share their own in turn. And we think that this is really key to developing the field. The fifth feature of successful scaling catalysts is dynamic leadership and interdisciplinary teams. So this came up a lot actually in our deep dive interviews, that part of the success of these organizations is the way that they combine dynamic, proactive, charismatic, and well-connected leadership with different forms of expertise across the organization, such as in facilitation, communication, stakeholder engagement, and much more. So we wanted to spotlight these dynamics of agency and team building that we think are often neglected. And we suggest that it's through this combination of dynamic leadership and distributed forms of knowledge that catalysts can become most effective in their work. And the sixth feature we discuss is the physical space matters. So when we think about scaling, it's very common or natural to think about online deliberation platforms. This is where a lot of the discourse and focus has been. But really interestingly, something that came up a lot in our interviews was the physical spaces that some of these scaling catalysts have. So you can see some on the screen here. I'll talk through them in a moment. And the kind of general point here is that having a physical space and having this material infrastructure lays the foundation for in-person connection, convenings, capacity building, and much more. And we think that this is important for laying the foundations for relational democratic culture change. It was interesting actually because there are some limits to the importance of physical spaces. So, for example, with our interviews with colleagues in Australia or Brazil, where they're such massive countries, it came up as less important. But we definitely think that as part of a wider infrastructure, especially at local, regional, and at sometimes national levels, this is really important and warrants further attention in future practice and research. And so on the slide here, you can see in the top left the Democracy Garage in Copenhagen, which is the space of We Do Democracy. Also in the middle, you can see in the hills of the Basque Country, Arendt's Lab's physical space. And so something that was also quite on the different types of physical spaces and the kinds of benefits that they can bring. So, for example, the remoteness of Arendt's Lab's physical space came up as a benefit for enabling deeper forms of reflection and contemplation, whereas the kind of embeddedness of the Democracy Garage in Copenhagen itself was important for enabling everyday kind of engagement and proximity to people in the city. So the second part of the paper, we dive in to talk about tensions, critical considerations, and limitations. And just as like a general framing here, something that we want to do is walk the line between celebrating and spotlighting the successes of these particular scaling catalysts, whilst also being upfront about the tensions and challenges that these organizations necessarily face. So these organizations are part of a wider political economy and institutional configuration and setting that can often distort the realization of democratic ideals as we go from democratic ideals to real world and complicated practices. And so one of the challenges that came up and that we want to focus in on here is collaboration and coordination. So how do scaling catalysts fit alongside other actors in the ecosystem? And again, the underlying current is the complexity of democratic systems. So there are a lot of stakeholders and actors involved in commissioning, planning, delivering democratic innovations, and it can sometimes be hard to establish roles and remits. And what is the role of scaling catalysts within all of this? Scaling catalysts, interestingly, sometimes from a more critical angle, got characterized as swooping in or imposing their own vision of what democratic innovations require. And this is also something that we think is important to pay attention towards and navigate. And so we provide a few suggestions towards that end, such as paying closer attention to the political economy of democratic innovations, better and more elaborate ecosystem mapping, and also ensuring that scaling catalysts draw on local forms of knowledge and expertise that already exists often within these contexts. And I'll pass to Claudia to talk about funding and sustainability.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy. So one of the other main challenges that came up for a lot of, if not most of the interviewees that we spoke with related to funding sustainability. So most of the scaling catalysts are set up as nonprofit organizations, and many of them rely on short-term and project-based funding that's both irregular and precarious, whereas the scaling work that we've been talking about really needs patient, long-term investments in relationships and in infrastructure. So while we do democracy in Denmark and so central in Norway, for example, are maybe exceptions where they have blended finance models that also include revenue from their physical spaces, we also recognize that these remain quite difficult to replicate in most contexts. And it suggests to us that providing longer term grants that support this ecosystem building part of the work beyond just supporting kind of one-off assembly initiatives is really essential if we want democratic innovations to scale. So beyond these individual organizations that we looked at, part of our interest was also in what are the frontiers of future practice. And so both in terms of asking our interviewees what they thought and like looking a bit into the kind of wider work that we're doing at the moment around these kind of questions, we identified 5 frontiers of future practice for scaling democratic innovations. And again, we'll talk through these one-on-one. So I'll pass back to Sammy now.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. So the aim of in this part of the paper is really to try to identify, as Claudia was mentioning, blind spots in the field, draw attention to promising developments in relation to each of these, and foreground what we take to be high potential directions for future research and practice and investment in the field. So the first that we talk about in the paper is deliberative technologies and AI. So a lot has been said and a lot has been speculated around opportunities and risks of deploying AI and other forms of deliberative technologies into democratic innovations. And we don't so much revisit these particular debates here. Claude and I have written about this kind of thing elsewhere, but rather in the spirit of the paper, we try to spotlight some of the wider capacity building and the movement building and civic infrastructure building that is required if some of the promises that are made around AI and deliberative technologies are actually to be realized in practice. So the kind of underpinning thrust of this is that technological diffusion and uptake of technology of deliberative technologies is socially, economically, politically, and also relationally shaped. And therefore, we need to attend to these wider dynamics more closely if we are to realize the potential of these tools. And so, to this end, we spotlight 3 different interventions. So, one around practitioner learning. So, we need to develop better means for practitioners to test and learn about what technologies and what deliberative technologies exist. We call for better coordination between deliberative technologies and deliberative technologists. So foregrounding things like interoperability and ease of use between different types of deliberative technologies that exist, and also paying closer attention to the political economy that underpins them. And then lastly, we call for more co-design and cross-pollination. So increasing the number of spaces for stakeholders to shape and learn about deliberative technologies in a grounded and informed way. And what this means for the future of democratic innovation. And the second frontier we discuss is education. And this was actually the most common response when we invited interviewees to reflect upon the most powerful enabler of spreading deliberative practices and other forms of democratic innovations in their region. So the idea here is to start with schools and universities to embed deliberative practices in civic culture and to exercise deliberative muscles from a young age. And so we agree that this is a significant blind spot in our current in the field at present, and this could have potential knock-on effects for the change-making potential of the field. So we propose this to hopefully encourage more research, investment, and practice around education and deliberative democracy. And the third frontier that we discuss is legal participation frameworks. So when we think about scaling in a broader context, one of the inhibitors that we can see is deeply ingrained political inequalities within participation. So we know that even the best kind of sortition, random selection process, and the best kind of outreach mechanisms that we have are vulnerable to perpetuating types of inequalities. And whilst it's probably impossible to totally eradicate these inequalities, one important intervention point that came up in our interviews was legal frameworks that can support and enable more inclusive and more equal forms of participation. And so we propose maybe learning from jury duty structures around the world. For example, things like mandatory payment for participation or protection from employment consequences could be something that is important for the field to consider going forward. And I'll pass back to Claudia.
Thanks, Sammy. So the fourth frontier that we talk about in the paper relates to community building. So scaling requires people, and that includes people to build the movement as well. So through the interviews that we did, there were three types of networks that came up. Also, these are some of the ideas that we have been working on and talking about at DemNext, but also in the field more broadly. So one is networks for practitioners. So the kind of mentorship programs for new practitioners who want to learn facilitation, process design, and advocacy. So while there are international practitioner networks like the Democracy R&D network, here the focus is more on like locally based networks to be able to do that kind of mentorship and training. The second being networks of civil servants. So the public officials who are commissioning and championing deliberative processes, they can sometimes feel a bit isolated. And we also have growing examples all over the world, especially of institutionalized and permanent assemblies. And so having better connections between those who are involved for mutual learning would be a benefit in terms of helping to advance this further, because it's not always easy to push this through on the inside when you're in the public administration and make this change happen. And the third is around former assembly members. So people are often transformed by the experience and want to stay engaged somehow. And yet there are also rarely structures that enable this kind of newfound democratic energy to find a place and find a way forward. At the same time, there's also a gap in research about the long-term impacts of people who have participated in citizens' assemblies. And so there's multiple reasons why having better networks, a few of them exist at local levels in some places. One of our ambitions is to connect those networks of networks in a global way that could also help with some of the movement's wider advocacy efforts, but also fill in these missing knowledge gaps in research that we have today. And then finally, the fifth point was about public communication. So this also came up quite a bit in the conversations that we had, and the way we frame it is really as seeing it as crucial infrastructure and that it remains significantly underdeveloped. So while it's not the case in many of the scaling catalyst organizations that we interviewed, we know that for many organizations in the field, they don't always even have a comms person, let alone a comms team. And yet the fact of making deliberative democracy visible and compelling remains really important if we want this to scale. So various ideas came up through our interviews related to the translation of outputs for wider publics, how to make those more interesting, more engaging, not just PDF documents, investing in storytelling and narrative work that can help build the demand for these kinds of democratic innovations, maybe developing some shared comms infrastructure for the field. Precisely to the point I was just saying about the fact that some organizations have more or less resources to invest in this, but also ensuring that comms budgets are not seen as just a nice to have, but are actually essential if we want to achieve the kind of impact that we desire. So there's a lot that we have kind of covered in this paper. We're kind of giving also the highlights and the overviews in this presentation here, but wanted to share as well some of the main takeaways that we took from kind of thinking about this research holistically for the different kinds of target audiences that we had in mind. So for philanthropists and funders, the main point really being that scaling deliberative democracy and democratic innovations more broadly requires patient, flexible funding that supports not just process delivery, but this ecosystem building. For the emerging catalyst organizations that want to get set up or want to strengthen what they're doing. We recommend building for the long term in mind from the beginning, evaluating success systemically, and also transparently acknowledging the tensions and the trade-offs that are involved in the nature of this work. For the established organizations, making the ecosystem building part of your work more visible through strategic communication might be one thing, investing in documenting and sharing what you learn, creating more explicit strategies for navigating tensions, and considering how to expand beyond your organization's direct reach are some of the things we considered, knowing that some of you are already doing some, if not all of these things, depending on the context. And then for government officials and policymakers, also some recommendations about not commissioning just one-off assemblies and recognizing that for systemic democratic change, there's also a need to be investing in the civic infrastructure that makes sustained deliberative practice possible. And finally, for researchers, significant gaps still remain in our understanding. So we also recognize that we're just sort of giving some general outline of a few ideas in this initial first paper, but there's still many gaps and many research ideas to be building on further. So we sketch out some of those future pathways as well. So really to conclude, 10 years ago, if we look back, citizens' assemblies and other kinds of democratic innovations were rare experiments. And today they are becoming normalized democratic infrastructure in multiple countries and regions. And this didn't just kind of magically happen by accident. It really happened because dedicated organizations did that strategic relational capacity building work that makes scaling possible. And in an era of democratic backsliding, polarization, and institutional distrust, democratic innovations demonstrate that people, given these good conditions, can govern wisely and well. So we see the next phase of scaling requiring moving beyond leading organizations doing individual work in isolation. It requires building robust civic infrastructure, the networks, norms, physical spaces, knowledge systems, legal frameworks, educational pathways, and communication channels that can sustain democratic innovations as a permanent feature of governance, not a temporary innovation. Another democratic future is possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Sammy. Truly insightful contributions there, and I think a wonderful opening to the conversation to come. I would also just thank those of you who are submitting questions through the Q&A function. I can already see we have really rich questions here, and so I think it'll be a great discussion. I want to invite our three discussants into the fold now. I'm really pleased to be welcoming Josh, Nicole, and Kelly to join us in this conversation. I think each of them brings a really unique and deep expertise here. And so looking forward to hearing their reflections. I'll introduce them in the way that they'll be speaking for about 7 minutes each. So starting with Nicole. Thanks so much for joining us, Nicole. Nicole Curato is professor of democratic governance at the University of Birmingham. Her research demonstrates the transformative power of deliberative governance in fragile and conflict-afflicted settings. Josh Burgess is DemocracyNext Senior USA Advisor and the Director of the Central Oregon Civic Action Project. Building on the initial Deschutes Civic Assembly that took place last year, Josh is in the midst of collaborating with other local actors to set up the kind of lasting civic infrastructure for Central Oregon to support deliberative and participatory democracy in the region. And last but certainly not least, Kelly McBride is the Director of Capacity Building and Standards at Involve. She leads the organization's efforts to build capacity for effective public participation across institutions and with communities throughout the UK and Europe. So thanks so much for joining us, the three of you. I want to start off with Nicole. So as we've already discussed, this idea of scaling deliberation or scaling democratic innovations is being discussed super widely right now in both practitioner and academic contexts. Nicole, you're coming at this from more of an academic perspective. Can you tell us your understanding of how this paper contributes to the broader discourse around scaling democracy and how you view maybe gaps in the conversations as they currently exist?
Yes, thanks, Andrew, and hello, everybody. And of course, congratulations to Claudia and Sammy for this timely paper. So as you mentioned, Andrew, I'm reading this paper from the perspective of an academic working in the field for the past 15 years. So I think I'll summarize my reflections into three, although in my initial draft, I had 23. So let's stick to my top three favorites. So first, the question of scaling has actually long been central in the academic literature, even though the terminology has evolved over the years. So 20 years ago, my colleague at the University of Canberra, John Dryzek, and Bob Gooden from the Australian National University spoke of the macro-political uptake of mini-publics. 10 years ago, my collaborator, Marit Hammond, and I framed this debate as the challenge of linking mini-publics to deliberative systems. So across this work, the shared insight is that democratic innovations are not one-off interventions, so very much aligned with the spirit of the paper. They are embedded in complex political and cultural systems. And we argue actually that their effects can either be productive or counterproductive to democracy, depending on how they are linked, embedded, institutionalized, and scaled within those systems. So I think what this paper does so well is it opens up the black box of what that embedding actually looks like in practice. So they use the term of a holistic ecosystem. They make a case for building intentional infrastructure and relational work and network building, among others. And they really outline the concrete steps that catalyze the scaling up of these innovations, while this has remained predominantly theoretical in academic debates. So fast forward to today, I think this paper aligns strongly with recent comparative work, including the latest publication by colleagues Benjamin Goldfrank, Melissa Ross, and Janina Welp on Latin America, where they examine the conditions under which participatory innovations become durable, legitimate, and impactful. I think there's a productive conversation between the two papers. The EU-funded project Scale Dem. Their research agenda is so well aligned with this paper. And part of that research agenda also analyzes, if I'm not mistaken, 300 democratic innovations to understand what drives and what hinders scaling. But personally, where I think the conversation would be most valuable is around the debate on the normative purpose of scaling. So the paper clearly states intriguingly that scaling is not a normative goal in itself, and I completely agree. But I think the harder question we need to collectively answer as researchers and practitioners is, what exactly are we trying to achieve through scaling? Are we primarily concerned with legitimacy, inclusion, redistribution of power, radical systems change, or incremental reform? And different answers actually imply different scaling capacities and strategies and associated risks. Second, I very much appreciate the paper's argument that scaling democratic innovations requires intentional infrastructure building. And the paper is focused on civil society organizations as scaling catalysts, and I found that rather illuminating. But for me, it raises an important question for future research and practice. So is intentional infrastructure building primarily the remit of civil society, or can or should the state become a primary scaling catalyst? Because when we think about civil society leading the scaling, we gain independence, experimentation, and critical distance. But when it's led by the state, we gain resources, authority, and stability. But we may also lose some of the very qualities that make democratic innovations transformative in the first place. So I'm very curious to think about who should be the primary driver or primary catalyst of scaling. Of course, the answer is yes, it's collaborative, But I think when we're talking about who's taking the lead, I think there is a normative argument for either the state or civil society still. The final point I wish to make is one line that resonated most strongly with my own research. The paper, if I may quote, says, although connections to power holders is essential, proximity to power also comes with risks. And this connects directly with the research that I've done with my colleague Lucy Parry on deliberative integrity, where we studied the ethical conditions under which citizens' assemblies remain credible. So Claudia and Sammy's paper framed the response to this tension as a balancing act, that scaling catalysts should be close enough to influence, but distant enough to maintain integrity. So in our own work, in our interviews with over 60 members of the global deliberative democracy community of practice, we actually found a more divergent range of views related to this. So some argued along similar lines to the paper's respondents that balance is key, but we also found others to suggest that rather than seeking proximity to established centers of power, democratic innovations should actively work to reconfigure power and actually actively work with the powerless or the grassroots communities. Others, on the other hand, argue that it is almost inevitable that people with power will become irritated with citizens' assemblies. And when that happens, it's not a failure, but it's actually a sign that assemblies are doing what they're supposed to do, which is to disrupt existing systems rather than just supporting them. So I think I'll end my comments there. My hope, obviously, as an academic, is to stimulate even richer dialogue between academic research and practice-based knowledge about the democratic futures that scaling is meant to serve.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I think that leads us quite cleanly into Josh's reflections as well. Josh, I guess I'm hoping you can take up the mantle here of talking a bit more about your experience navigating these tensions, especially in the context of your experience with the Deschutes Assembly. I'm curious to hear what it required to resolve these decisions that we can talk about at a theoretical level and also that become complicated and messier on the ground. And so I know Claudia and Sammy and Nicole as well kind of ran through a few of them, the tension between independence and trying to have influence with decision makers, the tension between standardizing processes so that we have some sort of evaluative I guess baseline for measurement and also to maintain flexibility and adaptability with these processes. I'm wondering how you think about this and how your experience has been there.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Nicole, that last point was the perfect segue. So I do appreciate it. And I'm going to come to that in just a few moments. But just to give a little bit of context, I feel like my connection to this paper is really in that section where we talk about who it's for, and we are here in Central Oregon an emerging catalyst. So I'm the founder of the Central Oregon Civic Action Project, which we established just about 2 years ago to put on one of what I think was one of the first in this new sort of US deliberative wave of deliberative practices. So we put on the Deschutes County Civic Assembly on Youth Homelessness in the fall of 2024. And as we were constructing that and building relationships for a single event across our region, we were simultaneously keeping in mind the idea that we didn't want this to be a one-off event and trying to learn from some of the best practices around the globe. For deeper context, Central Oregon, for those of you who don't know it, is a unique part of the U.S. Pacific Northwest. High desert. It's about 8,000 square miles of 3 counties, 8 municipalities, and a confederated tribal region. We do have it's really marked by some of the tensions that we're seeing in the divisions more broadly in our country. Bend, Oregon is an urban, very progressive center. The rest of the region is seen as very conservative. And so we've got these political and socioeconomic and sometimes ethnic differences and bridges that we're trying to bridge through these processes. So building off of the success of that first engagement that we had with 30 delegates over the course of 5 days who came up with significant recommendations that are being adopted in part at the local and state level, we've had to decide how do we balance all of those tensions. This is my focus for how to discuss our context with the paper. And I think I'll start that with the idea of the tension and the balance between quality and context. We talk about the resources that are involved in putting on a civic assembly. Of course, those resources include cost and the funding that's required. And when we're doing innovative processes, when we're trying to break paradigms, oftentimes we're left sort of on the outside of traditional funding. And so we do need to sort of acknowledge that there are some compromises to be made. But we did feel for the very first one we were going to do, the quality had to be impeccable. We brought in partners from across the field to ensure that we were employing best practices, using lessons learned, local partners, regional partners, global partners such as DemocracyNext. And I feel like that's one of the best ways to try to help balance that innate tension. Also, though, that comes right back around to the tension of experimentation versus institutionalism. If we are going to experiment, whether that's with new deliberative technologies, whether it's with new types of engaging with the community in person, we have to accept that experimentation comes with some risks. And we did make some mistakes here, and we're learning from those as well. And I'll talk about, for instance, our I won't say failure, but perhaps we could have done better at engaging with the community in advance of and during our initial assembly with social media, sort of meeting people on the communication side where they are. Now that we're looking to move forward into a space where we're engaging across such a big region with small towns and municipalities, with rural areas that may not have the ability to experiment on their own, we're looking to build an actual regional hub that will eventually turn into a physical space. But at the outset, we're really focusing more on building the capacity to design and implement and follow up on various types of deliberative processes. What that looks like for us is then diving into the next tension, which is what Nicole talked about in her research, which is how close, what kind of proximity do we have to our actual existing institutions? And I've always believed from the outset that there should be some level of firewall between the institutions that we're trying to change and that we're trying to sort of rebuild this cycle of virtuous trust between institutions and the public. But then again, there has to be some habitual relationship between those organizations and the grassroots organizations as well. And I think what we're sort of adopting as our premise here is that we can best change those institutions by embracing them, bringing them into and sort of forcing their hand in a way. And many cases that involves finding young and innovative-minded individuals who exist within those institutions and bringing them along with us. Our hub that we're trying to build right now is being incubated by our local council of governments because they have reach into all the areas of our region, but we're also partnering with our community college system that also has offices across the region, with our local university, with chambers of commerce, with economic development organizations. We've just formed a steering committee that has members and civic leaders from across the region, including our tribal areas, who are going to bring their voices into building a strategy for the region and then how to implement that strategy. And I think that goes into that tension of strong leadership versus distributed influence. At the outset of building this new type of civic infrastructure, it's really been sort of on a few small individual, a group of small folks like myself. I'm not a small person, maybe a small group of individuals. But I think that's not how we want to have it continue. I think what we would prefer to do, and which is why we've now established this steering group of 15 community leaders from across the region, is we want to hand that influence and that leadership back to the community so that there is an ability of everyone to sort of balance out the tensions that exist and those that we're trying to address with our new ability to build capacity across the region. And the last thing that I'll address that wasn't so much directly focused in the paper, but it's the idea of what happens when we do this really, really well. And something that I think is important to address is the idea of catastrophic success, as we used to call it in my military career, which, as we become more mainstream, as we're seen as pushing back upon existing systems and looking to create new paradigms, there will be an antibody response from those. So we need to sort of be ready with risk mitigation measures for communicating that this is the type of processes that we're trying to build for the entire community, that it isn't just for specific areas, and that it also is not, in most cases, I will argue, meant to replace existing institutions, but rather to augment them, to change them for the better, and to create innovative new ways to ensure that everyone has the capacity to participate in making their own shared decisions in their own context. I'm happy to look at some of the more important points that are coming up next.
Thanks so much, Josh. Yeah, and that's definitely a point I want to come back to later in the conversation, because I see a number of questions in the chat about the relationship between democratic innovations and established institutions and what that should look like, and so on. But first, I want to get to you, Kelly. So maybe we can widen the conversation here a little bit. I see some questions in the chat already from folks like Tomas about the role of civil society, and I'm reminded of writing by folks like Tocqueville who say that democracy can't really survive without this very vibrant civil society. And I think oftentimes, especially in the context of scale and catalyst, we're thinking about the kind of one-directional relationship between scale and catalysts and political institutions or funders or technologists, when really there is a great deal to which the scale and catalysts themselves are reliant on broader civic infrastructure that exists in society. And so I'm wondering, Kelly, if you can talk a bit about that in your experience at Involve and in the UK more broadly.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly. I'm in Edinburgh in Scotland today. And I just want to start by acknowledging that, addressing this is no easy feat. There's a lots of complexity inherent in it, and we're still working through the language that we use. But I imagine that people in this room are broadly trying to make democracy work better in all our different and wonderful ways. There's a lot going on in the world beyond this screen. Practitioners are stretched. We can even see that in the comments coming through. Funders are navigating constraints, policymakers are managing all sorts of instability and budget pressures. And yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that many people working in and with community, those people out on the front line, they're exhausted in many ways. They're supporting people through crisis after crisis. And we're all working within a system that wasn't really designed for what we're trying to do. And for me, that's really why this paper matters, and I really welcome and appreciate the work that's gone into it. It names what many of us have been experiencing, and there's been so much brilliant progress on things like the practice and the building the case for participation and deliberation and approaches like citizens' assemblies. But scaling democratic innovation for me is an infrastructure challenge. It's that challenge of making the participatory and deliberative approaches we champion a part of everyday democracy. And I use that wording intentionally. And what I really appreciate about the paper is its emphasis on that human, relational, social and political dimension, which I feel is essential for quality scaling. And that's, not necessarily just the technology, it's not just the design templates, but it's speaking to the relationships, to the skills, the structures, and kind of like patient and dynamic navigation of complex challenges. And it builds on that what of scaling, which I think was a previous webinar in that paper. And from my perspective, without investment in some of the civic and social infrastructure, we will struggle to build out and up and across and deepen in, or we will risk doing it in ways that could be detrimental, like having processes at higher levels and higher profile that sound great on paper, but they're quite hollow and limited in the impact that we have. So for me, that's about how we build what happens next, and we ensure impact and legacy of our processes as we're also trying to make them part of the system and scale them. So yeah, I'll ground what I'm saying in some of what I'm saying in an example from Scotland. So here there was a working group that was set up and worked for a couple of years to develop a roadmap for how we might embed democratic participation. And what emerged wasn't just a plan for more citizens' assemblies, although there was partly a focus on that, but there was thinking in there about what we might need to scale in practice. And some of it sounds quite big and quite grand, but some of it can be done pretty readily if the will was there. It was everything, including a dedicated unit within the Scottish Government to build internal culture and maintain quality, ensure we properly report on the impact of participation when that's invited by government. It was a participation academy for training so we can develop skills and pathways for people to do this work. People want to get into doing this work and they're not sure how, including within and across civil society. It was working towards a National Centre for Participation so we could build an evidence base and continue making the case and kind of be a bit of an observatory for what's going on. And ensuring quality standards and principles underpin that across all levels of governance. And we build that interest and understanding through cross-sector partnerships. And there is just one angle there on what infrastructure looks like, but in that sense, it's dedicated capacity and training and quality frameworks and sustained partnerships, and it's opportunities to bring the wider public and civil society into the fold on the journey of what we're trying to build. So they're not just there within and in process, but they're also trying to build with us too. And I think the lesson is that building this obviously takes time. It's going to take some will, including political will, and really importantly, some sustained investment. Because, yeah, one of the concerns that I often sit with is some initial upfront investment that is taken away without kind of that long-term plan for how you maintain something going. And we know ideas like this have some general support, but we are still lacking that initial investment. And I appreciate that there are lots of real constraints, budget pressures, political cycles, competing priorities, but it's sometimes not until we're staring a crisis in the eye that we're moved to take action and things are resourced. But I think if we're not building some of that foundational stuff, we're kind of building some of this on sand. And yeah, if I think about the kind of full ecosystem, the paper identifies some features of catalyst organizations, but for me, it revealed something I think is critical. And that's that there are so many organizations that aren't explicitly working on democratic innovation that are absolutely essential to the success of the work that we're doing. So how do we connect with that? I'm thinking about the community connectors, the grassroots organizations, the youth workers, and the people that are in the heart of communities that navigate everyday challenges like the cost of living pressures, a lack of access to nutritious food, building confidence in communities and with people so they feel like they can step into an assembly we're facilitating and speak. And they're the people that hold the deep knowledge, trust, and relationships. I'm working on an assembly in Dunfermline right now, which is Scotland's newest city, with the Electoral Reform Society and Fife Council and lots of other brilliant folk. And it's been really interesting to see the benefits of partnering with community learning and development specialists there in the council, and that people are working in the community who know their neighbours. And we're all learning together about what an ecosystem approach looks like when you bring together community orgs and local government and deliberative practitioners. So I'm excited to see when an approach like that goes and how it might flip into kind of community organising and more partnership working. But I would love to see a shift towards longer term and unrestricted funding for civil society and community-based organisations. And again, they might not be explicitly working on democracy, but if we're serious about scaling out and deep and reaching diverse people and creating lasting impact, then we need to support them, because it's not just about process, it's about enabling spaces for people to connect, to build confidence, to tell their stories and to learn. And there are other ways to do this democracy thing, and hey, it could be good. You know, where's that message coming from and where can people learn? So yeah, I work for Involve. We're an organisation that's been going for about 20 years in the UK, and a few years back deliberately brought together 3 functions that we felt were needed to work together for scale and impact. And that touches on the interdisciplinary approach we see in the paper. So we've got functions that look at things like innovation and practice, so the design and facilitation of these processes, but really importantly also capacity building and standards and advocacy and communications. And we try and bring all those things together because that interdisciplinary point feels really important. Not everyone does everything, but the ecosystem needs all these functions connected and resourced. I really like the language of bridge builders in the paper. I thought it was a great way to describe the work that many of us practitioners do, working across boundaries between kind of communities and institutions and policy and practice and the everyday and the strategic. But I found myself starting, and I've noticed I've started referring to some of the assembly commissioners at the local level as being connectors, enablers, and influencers of change. And that's the way, you know, a difference in how I thought about the practice I do a while back. And it's come from a place of acknowledging that sometimes commissioners of these processes can't act on all of the recommendations alone, and they need to work with partnership, but they're often not well set up to do that. So how can we take that into consideration too? Briefly on physical infrastructure, I loved the discussion of that in the paper. I really thought the democracy hubs matter. They signal commitment, but if democracy is every day, we need to meet people where they are too, and that's the high streets and the centres and the youth spaces. And we have that threshold problem, you know, people feeling that spaces aren't for us. So with civic infrastructure disappearing over decades, like community centres closing, library shuts, even pubs going under, I do think we need to think about that physical infrastructure point quite importantly and differently. So a model that is distributed and accessible and embedded in everyday life sounds really good. So yeah, if I'm honest, there's loads in this paper that I think is really, really brilliant. It makes quite a good case for funding to support ecosystem building if you think about it. It might seem like a big ask, but if we're serious about scaling this, we need to invest in, you know, the boring stuff, dedicated units, training infrastructure, quality frameworks, partnerships, and that long-term support for community orgs as genuine partners in everyday democracy. Yeah, when we get into the discussion, I've got a few questions that I had related to the 5 frontiers, but what gave me hope in all of this, just to end, is like seeing the pieces connect, those community organizations recognizing their roles as connectors and funders thinking differently and practitioners and community stakeholders learning together. And the insight for me is that we need far more than excellent catalyst organizations. We need that ecosystem that is funded sustainably, connected meaningfully, rooted in communities that makes everyday democracy possible. And we can start with some honest conversations about longer term capacity building needs and all that good stuff. But this, for me, to end, isn't about one organization doing everything. It's about all of us as those connectors, enablers, and influencers of change and building some foundations that make everyday democracy possible. So yeah, that's the scale that's worth building towards, I think.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really appreciate all three of those reflections. So much of it resonates with me personally, and such different angles you all took there. And also, I should say, as a moderator, you each stuck to the timing almost perfectly. So thank you. Just to add two more of my own reflections into the mix here, before I bring in some of the questions from the Q&A. One thing that came to mind, and I'm coming at both of these points from more of a technological angle because that's what a lot of my exposure is in my work. Obviously, in Silicon Valley, there's the old mantra that we move fast and we break things. And in the democracy space, we don't want to break things, and I think that is good. However, I think there's also something to be said with the urgency of the current moment, right? And so I think the work of building an ecosystem of democratic innovation is a longer horizon project. It is something that relies on building relationships, and also there's a lot of precarity right now around the geopolitical, the political moment. On the technology side, it seems like every year we are experiencing an entirely new world. And so I was wondering, on the timing point, we need sustainable funding and longer horizons, and also thinking about things in timelines of 5 to 10 years is a little difficult when we don't know what the world will look like in 10 years. And so a question might be, as we move along this pathway to a more democratic society, what are the signs of progress that we should be looking for, the metrics of success along the way, even if we're not yet at the final destination in 6 months or a year, right? The second thing that I'll say, also on the technology front, is that I agree when we talk about scaling democratic innovations, it's not a strictly technological question, right? It's not as if the technology is created and then the democratic deficit is solved or something like that. And I really appreciated still the first frontier of the paper, which is thinking about the integration of deliberative technologies into these processes. And I would think that there's something lost if democratic practitioners don't try to become well acquainted with the tools that exist to improve these deliberative processes, and to equip themselves with more power as they facilitate conversations, and include more people in the room at once. And I know that this is something that Claudia and Sammy are very keen to do as the co-leads of the Deliberation and Technology Network that they've been building up with the AI and Democracy Foundation. So with that, I want to bring in some questions from the Q&A. I'm going to start with one perhaps directed to Nicole, though I think anyone can take this really, from Brian Morgan, who asked, have you considered any downsides to scaling?
Yeah, so earlier I mentioned the piece about institutionalization of democratic innovations in Latin America, and one of the examples of democratic innovations there is participatory budgeting, right? So when it started in Porto Alegre, it was very much politically embedded, it was socially embedded. That's why a lot of people look to Brazil, right, for inspiration for these participatory innovations. But the findings that they put forward in that paper actually is that when there was a legal framework already in place to basically scale up these participatory budgeting exercises, it became bureaucratized, it became professionalized, it became routine, and therefore it lost the depth that it originally had when it was more socially embedded in Porto Alegre. So I think that is an example of how to scale badly, right? Like one of the prescriptions the paper offers is we have to look at the legal infrastructures. And that's totally fair. But I think with the lesson from Latin America of a successful scaled up participatory innovation, maybe that legal infrastructure can also come with certain downsides, right? So I just echo the point in the paper that this is very contextual and we have to be more I guess, cognizant of the local ecology in which these assemblies are embedded.
I see you unmuted yourself, Kelly, and I was going to bring you in. I think maybe something that hasn't been discussed so far is about operating in an environment, whether that be geographic or otherwise, where there isn't really the ecosystem or infrastructure around these ideas, and how you work to build that up from ground zero. Kelly, I'm wondering if you have any reflections on like where you start.
Yeah, my first reflection is that it has to be a collaborative effort of people across the field to kind of make a case for how the scaling up could happen. If it ends up just being one organization, there is a risk. And one of those risks includes kind of the resource concentration that crowds out, say, democratic innovation, you know. So some organization or a small number build infrastructure and capacity, they could dominate, they can get funding, get contracts, they can get attention. And smaller, and it's usually more community-rooted actors get squeezed out. And one of the challenges that comes up when you do this at the really local level is a concern around professionalization that loses community roots in this type of work, that idea of like kind of people with credentials or standardized templates that feel parachuted in rather than community owned. And that will then limit, I think, like a broader base of people in that community getting involved and kind of like supporting the growth of these initiatives, particularly when resources are scant and you're in that kind of deficit mindset, which is something that we see certainly in the UK. You know, in the UK in the charity sector, that funding landscape is a really challenging one. And then the other thing that I would also talk about is kind of the potential for quality dilution and participation washing sometimes being a bit of a risk. So, you know, building infrastructure isn't a neutral thing in and of itself. It can mitigate some of the dangers that we see by not doing it, or it can entrench challenges as well. So you have to be quite thoughtful and I think come from a broad-based coalition position of building how you feel like these things should develop. And that's what we tried to do in Scotland, but, you know, we haven't quite got the resources to do what we wanted yet.
Thanks,
And
Josh. Feel free
dive
to
in there just for a moment, because I think that what Kelly alluded to there, the relational work, which is addressed in the paper, is absolutely critical. From day one here, I personally have put in, I don't know, hundreds of hours at least in meeting with elected officials, with administrative officials, with leaders of community groups, from Rotary clubs to veterans groups to service providers, to ensure that there's a common understanding of what we're trying to do, but also meeting them where they are. One of the great challenges, I think, of this type of process and infrastructure building in today's sort of political environment is that it can be viewed as a progressive type of initiative. And we've talked long and hard with conservative groups across our region to understand where their needs are, what their needs are, and how we can meet them. Which is why our little catchphrase for the Central Oregon Civic Action Project is your seat at the table. The idea of voice and security, and pardon me, how we can bring people back into the conversation.
I want to pick up, Josh, on something you said earlier about these innovations being meant to augment institutions, not replace them. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a bit more. I think that is a claim maybe that people have different perspectives on as well, right? And that even if this is about augmenting institutions, there might still be somewhat of a confrontation of power between new institutions and existing ones. And there are a number of questions in the chat about how you sell this to electeds, what that relationship looks like. especially if you are trying to go for much more than a one-off process, but rather an institutionalization of a process that runs concurrent to existing institutions or something like that. And so can you speak to that both from your experience in Oregon and maybe just as a broader theory?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's kind of the fundamental point of how you get started and how you make progress. I'll say in meeting with local leaders, I spent a lot of time digging into their own strategic plans and finding out what their objectives are. And I had a hard time. In fact, I never did find a municipal organization that didn't have improving civic engagement as a strategic objective. Now, how serious they are about that, can remain up to argument. But walking in the door with enabling civic leaders and elected officials to better connect with their electorate is a pretty winning argument, I've found. At the same time, there is a great deal of, I think we have a lot of opportunities right now to meet elected officials and institutions at inflection points. The idea of whether we need incremental change or very fast change. I mean, we're not looking to move fast and break things. They're already broken. And so the idea that this can be a way to involve more voices and actually end up building the electorate's trust in the elected officials. We met a lot of electeds here who were not necessarily skeptical of the process and of bringing more people in, but they were concerned that the ideas that they wanted to promote might not be the ones that were recommended by the elected bodies. And so it is a leap of faith. And there will be some actors who maybe don't want to act in good faith like that. But finding those who are and creating influencers from the inside has been invaluable for us from day one.
Thanks. I'm wondering if anyone else has questions or has comments on this point specifically about the relationship building element with institutions. Yeah, Claudia.
Yeah, can I come in on this, and I'll tie it a little bit to your question as well, Andrew, related to like this kind of like urgency, fastness versus like, testing, piloting, going with things, or doing things in the slower way. And I think the Oregon example is a really beautiful one that speaks to the fact of like, if you wanted to do just a one-off assembly to do something quickly and pilot something, you could do that way faster than if you decide from the beginning, actually, what we want to do is build some infrastructure here for the long term. So, as one of the things Josh was saying from the beginning, there was a commitment and an intention to do not just a one-off assembly. And so that meant all of this relational work of like literally hundreds of hours of Josh's time and others who have been involved around this project of having many conversations with many people. And so I think like the fruits of that initial investment and the initial longer term are paying off though with a more catalytic effect of this hub being set up for the region. But also, I mean, Josh hasn't mentioned this yet. Maybe you want to elaborate, but there's also other parts of Central Oregon that want to do next sets of assemblies, other institutions in that region beyond government, like the university, one of the museums, etc. So you're building up like a whole ecosystem where there are the skills, where there's not just one more assembly that might happen, but many, because there's now also like a network of people that know about this, that want to do this. There's skilled practitioners and facilitators in the region. And so, yes, it kind of takes more time and it's slower if you think from the beginning that like, yes, we want to build institutions and we want to invest in the longer run, but actually like the effects are way more catalytic if like ultimately what we're interested in is scaling, I think.
I'll dive back in for just one response to that, what Claudia just said, which is finding those ambassadors and champions within the community. I found that former elected officials were really valuable there. They still have enormous ties into the community and influence behind the scenes. But also that breadth that she alluded to, finding champions from a wide variety of sub-communities who can show that there is a grassroots movement that, in essence, if elected officials decide to ignore the impetus of the community to build these types of institutions, they do so at their own peril, electorally.
Totally. Yeah. I see. Please feel free to just jump in, Nicole, and then Kelly.
Yeah, I like that we are now talking about the importance of slowness when it comes to um, scaling deliberation, right? Initially, I felt like when we were talking about the deliberative wave and the explosion of all of these processes, there's a certain fastness to it, right? Like we're celebrating the speed at which this is being taken up. And I feel like what this paper is saying is actually we have to appreciate the slow, quiet, behind the scenes work for us to scale up these innovations. But actually, where we can get inspiration is from the tradition of indigenous deliberative democracy. So a colleague from New Zealand, Emily Beausoleil, published this fantastic paper on a Maori-led climate assembly in New Zealand. It started in 2019. It's only in 2025 that the climate assembly actually happened. And what happened in those interim years is not just the pandemic, but it's because they understand the importance of relationship building, right? Why should we just trust the state to come here and collaborate with us on climate assemblies, right? We have to know each other first. We need to be able to trust you. And so I like that someone quoted Angela Davies on the chat because there's a similar belief among the Maori people that the long way is the fast way, right? We can do this quickly with no legitimacy, but we can actually take our time and build infrastructure and build trust with each other before we actually do the climate assembly. How that fits funding models, I'm not too sure. In financial cycles, that is definitely a tension, but I'm glad that the slowing down of the deliberative wave is hopefully the next phase of how we talk about these processes.
Kelly.
Yeah, I think what I'm saying is pretty complementary to things that have already been said, but I think that approach of starting where people are and not going too hard, too fast, too soon. It's really important to build confidence in these approaches, both as a way of working, but as an individual that may be working within an institutional setting or out in a community that's going to be doing some work in support of these things. And sometimes that means that the first conversation you have isn't advocating for a citizens' assembly, but it's a broad-based conversation about the value of these types of approaches and whether going out into the community and testing different ways of engaging with the community is a good place to start, and whether that be a pop-up democracy or a workshop before you go into anything bigger. And I know, things we're looking at the minute are things like that maturity model and the readiness of organizations to do this type of work and how it can play out in an institutional setting, what you need internally to be able to make this do well. And one of the simple things that keeps coming up time and time again is just dedicated resource that is internal that can support the development of the skills and those quality standards and everything else, which sounds like a pretty simple solution in some respects, but it just keeps coming up time and time again because that allocation of resource just isn't there in the minds of some institutions at the minute.
Thanks. Yeah, and I just want to highlight one of the comments in the chat from Lori about Taiwan and this relationship between perhaps being inside and outside of the system. And it's difficult maybe to create one theory of grand strategy with how you have systems change at that level. But it at the very least probably requires some balance of external pressure and having champions within the government that can allow for this really systemic change in the way that I think we're all envisioning on this call. So I see a number of questions also about the role of deliberative processes, citizens' assemblies, and other ones within a broader democratic ecosystem. And by that, I mean like alongside other participatory processes, ballot initiatives, things like this. Claudia, can you maybe talk a bit about how you view that relationship and whether we should also be working on scaling those more participatory forms of democracy, if that's what different contexts are more familiar with, such as in the US in many places, or should we be thinking about, the sortition, the rotation, and the deliberation as being the central elements of the kinds of innovations we should be advocating for?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I mean, this came up also through the work that we were doing, because one of the things that we really both noticed and highlighted is that even though like the starting point for this research related to the kind of, I guess, broader mission of the work that we're doing was an interest in the scaling of deliberative practices and deliberative institutions. One of the things that was really clear is that all of the organizations that we have called these scaling catalysts are not working just on this. They have a wider like vision and focus on democratic innovations, on deliberative and participatory approaches. How do they fit together? How is there like how does that also link up to the relationship with government and other existing democratic institutions? So I think as much as I really believe in the like importance of having citizens assemblies and other deliberative processes that are centered with these principles of sortition, deliberation, rotation as quite central to the new institutions we're building, precisely because I think that we can be seeing them really as also new institutions, not just other kind of tools in a toolbox. I think we do need to see how do they interact? And I think when you're also looking at these questions holistically, you're also thinking about how do they actually like connect with one another and are not just like siloed individual things where you might have like one participatory process totally disconnected from another one that's going on and totally disconnected from the citizens' assembly. So I think that there's like that wider reflection on how does this all go together. And I think like at the end of the day, like that really hard question relates to power, which has come up a bit in the discussions today. Like Nicole touched on it a lot. Josh, you've been talking about it too. And I think for me, the centrality of things like citizens' assemblies is also because what we're seeing is more shifts of power when they're being set up as institutions that then might have a legal basis. And I know, Nicole, you also mentioned that there's like a question mark of to what extent and in what context does that help in terms of institutionalizing. But what we are seeing in many contexts is that when this is becoming something that is set up as a more ongoing legal permanent thing that comes with a different kind of shift of power and responsibility and accountability and legitimacy and all these other things that we're interested in as well. So I mean, I think this is a big question and there's lots to say, but maybe just to try and answer it a little bit.
Feel free to jump in, Sammy. I see you unmuted.
Yeah, maybe I can just build on a little bit there and try to draw a few threads together. It seems to me that something that's important and underpinning a lot of these reflections is a shift or a focus here around a more systemic approach to understanding processes and the way they connect to other sites of the system, to other types of democratic processes, as Claudia was speaking about, to other institutions, to civil society, as Kelly was speaking about. And I really loved the way that Nicole integrated some reflections from the academic literature. And so, of course, there's been this deliberative systems approach whirling around for a long time. And so I think it's nice to kind of situate some of our discussions there within that. And then I maybe just had like a little bit of a side point. I really loved Josh's point around how, as the success of these processes potentially increases, then we need to be thinking much more carefully around the risks that are associated with that, around co-optation and control. And Claudia and I spoke about maybe trying to map out some of that a bit more. And it made me think when Andrew, you were talking about the potential of deliberative technologies and the importance of them and experimentation with them, that we also need to think really carefully around the success there. Like if deliberative technologies can be, and AI can be a big enabler of some of these things that we're talking about, then questions around data governance, political economy, whose technology are we using becomes even more important, and what kinds of path dependencies, what kind of lock-in effects could be created. And so it leads to this interesting kind of situation, which is that actually I think the more optimistic that you are about the potential of citizens' assemblies, or the more optimistic you are about the potential of deliberative technologies, then the more seriously you have to take the questions of success. And then you need to think about all of these kind of long-term path dependencies, vulnerabilities that will arise. So yeah.
And I see if we could just tease it out for truly 1 or 2 more minutes, because I know this is a Pandora's box here. But there is a question in the chat about the relationship between citizens assemblies and digital tools, and how those tools can be used in constructive ways. I would love for someone to just give us a high level outline, and I would also direct everyone to the previous paper, the 5 dimensions of scaling democratic deliberation, which allows for a bit of a deeper dive into that question. But just to give us the architecture, maybe, Claudia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to speak to this a little bit. And I mean, even though here we are very much emphasizing the importance of the relational human slowness work, that doesn't mean that there's not a yes and in terms of an interest in what role does technology play in scaling, but also and scaling in different ways, as we talked about in the dimensions. There's an aspect of that that also relates to quality and enhancing the kind of normative goals that we're interested in achieving. So I think if one of my colleagues can share that previous paper that outlines in a lot more depth what we're thinking of. But also, Andrew, you alluded to this, that together with the AI and Democracy Foundation at DemocracyNext, the work Sammy is also involved with me, we launched the DelibTech Deliberation and Technology Network that brings together technologists and practitioners who are both, like, on the one hand, building technologies to be supporting and enhancing deliberative processes, and also practitioners who are wanting and are already piloting and testing them out in different ways. And I am quite optimistic about the fact that I think technology can be helpful for addressing some of the kind of like problems or shortcomings of traditional analog processes. And at the same time, I think there's like a big mindfulness about the fact that, there might be some things that are possible today to do with technology, and we should constantly be asking ourselves, like, but is this actually desirable? Is it helping us achieve the normative goals of why are we doing a deliberative process in the first place? So I think we're at like a pretty interesting, exciting, nascent point in this. And I also think actually one of the things that's exciting is that, like, we have focused a lot about citizens assemblies, and there's like more traditional deliberative processes that also in previous OECD work with my former colleague Yeva Chesnula-Tite, we had outlined like 12 different models of what has been happening so far. But I actually think also deliberative technologies open the potential for designing new kinds of processes that are deliberative and that are still trying to achieve some of the goals we care about, but that are totally different to a citizens' assembly today. So I think we're kind of entering a new realm of experimentation, but that one that also I think necessitates like a kind of critical lens. And I think Sammy also alluded to some of the other kinds of then knock-on and related questions that come up. So we do mention in the paper, like, one of the other things that I'm exploring right now with Stefan Verhulst from the GovLab at NYU is wanting to get off the ground something like a deliberative data commons, where we would create a governance structure and a way for data to live securely, like from these different deliberative processes in different places that are being recorded, with like different access to different people depending on the context, and like figuring out how to actually enable this data to live securely, but also as a way to help answer one of the questions you raised earlier, Andrew, about what are some of the metrics of success and how do we measure progress and other things. And I actually think totally new research pathways become possible when we have such data commons that might be able to come into existence too. So sorry, that was a little windy, long way to answer. There's so much to say on this question, but those are like some of the like hesitations and excitement there.
Super helpful, and would plus one all of that. But I realize we're approaching time. I want to just pose one other topic to explore here, which is another frontier in the paper, not so much the technology frontier, but the education frontier, that hasn't been discussed as much in our conversation so far. But there are a few questions in the chat that I would just want to highlight. So I was unaware of this, but I guess in Ireland there's going to be a national convention of 150 members, 30 of which are young people, on the future of education in Ireland. And there's another question about, we say we want to prioritize deliberative education or something like that. What does that look like? Is that more of a theoretical opening to expand the way that people, especially young people, think about the possibilities of what democracy looks like? Or is this more practical about like which methods practitioners should use, and what the actual process of deliberation looks like in practice. But yeah, I'm curious, any reflections, perhaps from Kelly or Nicole or Josh?
Yeah. So, many reflections. How do we build deliberative muscles from a young age and weave participation into civic education and that lifelong learning? Of course, for me, this is about learning for democracy rather than education, as kind of like the hard word education and the meaning that's imbued in that. Which for me is about, again, everyday democracy and the opportunities that we create in our formal education institutions, but also out in our communities, in our workplaces for people to come together to learn about what it takes to be involved in decision making and to share your views, because I really think we can't understate how challenging it is for many people to be invited into some of the spaces that emerge from institutions and to be put in a room, sometimes never having attended something like a conference for the first time, and then be asked to share a view when they've never had a positive experience with an institution that has some kind of power over the decisions that affect their lives. So we need to have spaces for people to learn and come together in community without that pressure, so that people are ready when the opportunity does come up, and we see these things happening at scale, which would obviously be amazing, to feel like they can enter that space and enter it on a footing which is one of confidence and feeling like they should be there. So there's something in that I think really needs to be addressed, as well as some of the other points that have been made around education, which are all really, really helpful, but contributing towards this culture of learning for democracy and everyday democracy.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in quickly since I am in the academe, and I get the point that it's important to have, a more structured approach to teaching what deliberative democracy is at a young age. But I also feel that pedagogically, it's most effective when students experience deliberation in the classroom, right? So, for example, one can imagine a university professor giving their students the opportunity to deliberate on the AI policy when it comes to assessments, right? Usually these policies are imposed from the top down. I have no illusion that British universities are democratic institutions. They're not. They're technocratic authoritarian institutions. And I'm making this call from the University of Birmingham, which is probably being surveilled. But that's the point. That's the reality. So I think we can also democratize what we can within universities, right? And try to push back with this technocratic logic. And that can start with policies on emergent technologies, because no one has the answers, but it has to be student-led as well. There are so many policies also that are targeting young people as vulnerable parts of the population, like social media ban. In Australia, there's a social media ban for under 16s, but one of the critiques against that policy is, have you talked to under 16s, right? So I think with policies that really target young people, then they have to be part of that conversation. So what's happening in Ireland is certainly an example. But I think the emphasis, more than just the formal education, is the deliberative experience in the classroom and outside it.
Thank you so much. And before passing it back to Claudia and Sammy for closing reflections, Josh, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I'll just say that we are considering working alongside education partners here in our local context is top of mind. We've met routinely with school board officials, with, as I mentioned before, the community college and university. We've had students involved in moderating our first assembly. We provided some training for those in the capacity building sense. We did open up our first assembly and future processes as well to age 16 and up. That was sort of where we decided, at least in the initial one, we had a 16-year-old in our first assembly. He's also now on our steering committee for the future board, as well as a college student. And what we're seeing is simultaneous strong interest in not only trying to involve student voices in those big decisions around the things that affect them, like use of social media or devices in school, but also in their own governance. The idea that it's possible to potentially replace what's often seen as sort of popularity contests and electing student bodies with something more deliberative. And there's some real strong interest here for that. And I think we've already witnessed some experiments in that at Harvard and MIT and other places. So we're keen to not only involve young people in order to sort of educate them more civically, but because we think they're going to have ideas that are going to educate us. We're certainly not trying to, establish some sort of paternal framework with young people who I found they surprise me every time I engage with them, which shows some of my biases. So I'll admit it.
Thanks, Josh. And I realize we're at time, so just want to throw it back to Claudia and Sammy for any final, very brief reflections, if you have them.
No, I mean, I'm mindful that we're at time and I have already spoken a lot. So I just want to respect everyone's time and say a huge thank you.
Sure.
Thank you to you, to Josh, to Kelly, to Nicole for speaking, but also thanks to everyone who joined and has left such amazing, thoughtful reflections, comments. I'm going to catch up on the chat reading after. So thanks very much. And I'm looking forward to continuing these conversations.
I fully agree. I think I'll take away from this Josh's idea of catastrophic success, and I think all of the contributions in the chat have been so wonderful, and I hope that this conversation seeds many other discussions outside of this context. So thank you everyone for taking the time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your days.